Here's a problem. It's not really a well-posed problem since there's no question on the board for you to think about, but it's the preamble to a problem. Two firms produce output, and they have a choice of technologies to use. A is a dirty technology, B is a little cleaner, and so on all the way up through technology E. And the problem here is that the community has an interest in the total amount of smoke that gets emitted, which it views as excessive. It wants to cut back on the total amount of smoke that's emitted here. And so it's considering a couple of options for doing that. One of the options would be to have, it wants to cut smoke back by half. One option would be to have each firm cut its pollution back by half. They're now using process A, so 4 tons of smoke each, 8 tons total. In the future, please, if you have to come in late, sit in the back, please. They're considering two processes. One is to have each firm cut back its pollution by half. Another is to tax pollution. Which approach to the problem would be better? How much better would it be? Can we put a number on that? That's the question for you to think about. Okay, externalities is the topic for today. This is a subject very close to my own area of interest. I believe that if you can acquire a deep understanding of externalities, there's probably no other step you could take that will be more enlightening to you as you attempt to understand what governments around the world are trying to do. Mostly what gets your attention when you interact with the government is that they tell you you can't do what you want to do. Why are they telling you that? In general, it's not just to exercise their authority and feel like big shots. They're telling you you can't do what you want to do because they have either explicitly or implicitly reached a judgment that if you're allowed to do what you want to do, you will cause undue harm to other people. It is not reasonable to demand an unfettered right to cause undue harm to others. Does anybody feel that he or she should have such a right? Many libertarians feel they should have that right. I want to do what I want to do. Full stop. What if what I want to do causes great harm to you, but is of hardly any benefit to me? Does it make sense for me to do it? That's not a question of interest to some libertarians. You just have a right to do what you want to do. I think no person who's reasonable would endorse a right like that. And if you understand the nature of externalities and how best to accommodate them, that will seem in the end to you like a perfectly reasonable position. If it doesn't seem like a reasonable position to you, make your views known to me. I'm not going to bite you. Send me an email. Explain to me why you think I'm incorrect about that. When I debate with people, I try to adopt the posture of saying nothing that a reasonable person could disagree with. I think that statement that I just offered is one that no reasonable person could disagree with, but I could be wrong about that. If you think I'm wrong, let me know. I'm a good sport. I'm willing to engage on issues like that. Okay, sometimes costs or benefits are outside the purview of the people who make decisions about what to do. We call them external costs, external benefits, or externalities. That's the short term for them. Let's see how the idea works in the context of specific examples. We've got Sarah, a violinist. She likes to practice. Her neighbor hears her practice and enjoys hearing her practice. She, however, responds in her choice of practice time only to her own personal costs and benefits. Will the amount of time she elects to practice on that basis be optimal from a social point of view? Well, we've got an externality here. It's not a bad thing in one sense, it's a good thing. He likes hearing the music, it's a positive externality. Will she practice the right amount? Here it's a good externality, but it leads to a bad outcome in the sense of being worse than an outcome that could have been achieved. So she's got her own marginal cost and marginal benefit curves. They have the usual shapes. You do the easy practice first, you work your way down the line, the practice gets more and more burdensome to you. The more you do of it, you get tired, you feel like, and the benefit of additional practice also has diminishing returns, it's downward sloping. She'll practice up until time t star. For her, the marginal cost of practice is exactly equal to her own marginal benefits, but here's her neighbor. He gets 15 cents of benefit per minute from listening to her play. She's not taking that into account when deciding how much to play, so she doesn't play enough. Why? Because when she stops, the benefit of an extra minute would be 65. The cost to her of an extra minute is only 50. It would be better for her to play on. But she has no incentive personally to do that because she's responding only to her own costs and benefits. What about a negative externality? Here we've got another neighbor, this time a curmudgeon, Harry. He doesn't like the sound of the violin that he hears. If she plays in response only to her own costs and benefits, will she play the socially optimum amount of time? Again, no, but this time the imbalance is in the opposite direction. She will again play up until t star, the same as before. Now, when she stops, her marginal cost is 50 again, but there's an additional cost that she's not taking into account. That's the nuisance value of her sounds to Harry. That's 25 cents a minute to him. And so the last minute she plays had a social cost of 75 cents, and it was a benefit of only 50 cents. She played too much. She played past the time when it would have been optimal for her to stop playing. Externalities can lead to suboptimal allocations if we don't try to make some allowance for them to account for these distortions. If you have a negative externality, people do too much. If you have a positive externality, they do too little. But both are suboptimal in the same general sense. So let's think about the traditional view about externalities and how it informs public policy. We've got a guy who can produce a product. He's just trying to generate a useful output for consumers to buy. He's not doing anything immoral or illegal, but it so happens that his production process is accompanied by smoke. And the smoke blows downwind and causes damage to Jones. He's also not doing anything wrong. He's just there, and the smoke causes harm to him. I'm going to summarize the options available to the two parties in this table. Smith can produce without a filter on his smokestack. In that case, he gets a gain of $245 a week, or he can put a filter on. His gain gets cut to $200 a week. The filter reduces the amount of damage done to Jones. If he has a filter, Jones suffers $35 a week in damages. Without the filter, he suffers $85 a week in damages. Why is this number bigger than this number? Because the filter costs money to install. If filters were free, everybody would have one. They're not free. They cost money to install. Why would anybody pay money to install a filter? Because filters produce benefits. Namely, they reduce the damages that people suffer. So if there's this externality, how will it be resolved? Well, let's suppose that Smith is not liable for smoke damage. The law says, make smoke if you want to. We're not going to do anything to you. suppose the two people can negotiate costlessly with one another. By that I mean they're not friends, they're not enemies, they don't have to rent a hall to have their discussion. They can just talk about this externality and reach agreements as they see fit with no cost to the actual discussion itself. That's what I mean by costless negotiation. So if they can talk to one another, will Smith install a filter? He doesn't have to. The law is silent about that. Will he install a filter? Well, why should he? It's expensive to install a filter. He's not suffering the damage from the smoke. Might Jones appeal to him and say it's the right thing to do? He might, but how do we know what Smith would say to that? He might say, yeah, maybe it's the right thing for you to stop complaining about the smoke. We do know this, however. The situation would be more efficient if there were a filter installed than if there weren't. So let's start from that observation and see where it takes it. Why do I say that? First of all, the cost of the filter is what? It's $45 a week. It's the difference between these two numbers. What's the benefit of the filter? It's the difference between these two. That's $50 a week. Should there be a filter? Yes, full stop. There's no ambiguity to that. There should be a filter. Why? Because if there's a filter, the pie will be bigger. And that immediately ought to give you a hint about how things would unfold if they could talk to one another. Remember, the efficiency principle says that if the pie is bigger, it's got to be possible for the pie to be divided up in such a way that each party gets a bigger slice than before. It's got to be possible to do that. So what's going to happen? Will a filter get installed if they can talk to each other? You ought to think, hey, all they would have to do would be to figure out how to divide up the pie, which would be bigger, so that each one gets a bigger slice than before. It's better to have a filter than not to have it. Can't we figure out a way to make it in our interest that we do that? That's the question. The filter costs $45, the benefits are $50. If Jones offers to pay Smith to install a filter, Smith should be willing to do so. What's the minimum offer Jones could make that would get Smith to say, yeah, I'll do it? $45, the cost of the filter. I'll give you $40 to install a filter. No, cost me $45. So I've got to give him at least $45. What's the most that he could ask for in return for installing a filter? Suppose he said, give me $55 or I won't do it. What would Jones say? All right, I'll just eat the damage from the smoke. It cost me $50. I'm going to give you $55. Give me a break. It's got to be somewhere in that narrow window to make it attractive to both parties. But if we can talk to one another, why wouldn't we agree to that? That's the whole idea in a nutshell of Ronald Coase, who won the Nobel Prize in 1991 for that idea. That's what they give a Nobel Prize for, some people say? So is this some rinky-dink prize they're doling out? You get one for doing that? Well, sometimes simple ideas are vastly more important than they seem at first glance. This is one of those ideas. The article that he wrote has been cited more times than any article ever published in economics before or since. It's an extremely important idea. Nobody believed it when he first offered this idea in an article as a throwaway section right near the end. The editor of the journal at the University of Chicago, where that paper was published, said, you've got to write this up as a separate paper. He did that. He presented the idea at the University of Chicago Law and Economics seminar. 22 people present at the seminar voted that it was a dumb idea before they heard the full discussion of the idea. When they'd heard the full discussion, they said, wow, this is right. They thought if Smith wasn't liable for damages, why would he install a filter? he would install a filter because it's efficient to install a filter, and if he didn't have the law pushing him to do it, he would have private parties offer him incentives to do it, because there's always a way to propose a deal that gives everybody more surplus than they had before if it's more efficient. They ended up calling his insight the Coase Theorem. This was a strategic blunder on the part of George Stigler, who decided to do that. Economists are very insecure about their math ability, and they want to put it on display in full force at every opportunity. Many economists objected that this isn't a theorem, where's the math? It's just words. You call that a theorem? They were complaining. Call it whatever you want. You want to call it the Coase insight? I like that better. It's an insight. If the law tells people what they're allowed to do, and if they can talk to one another without cost, then they will always arrive at efficient solutions to whatever problems are caused by externalities. If Harry doesn't like the violin, he'll give her some money to get her to quit playing so much. If the law doesn't require her to be silent, they'll work out a solution on their own. The conservatives at the University of Chicago loved the Coase Theorem because it was a way to justify, get the government off my back. There are externality problems. The government's telling me I can't do what I want to do. People work it out for themselves. We don't need the government. People can get there on their own. That wasn't the full force of the argument. This is what would happen if people could negotiate without any impediment with one another. But often they can't. Coase's very first paper, it was also cited by the Nobel Committee, was one on why we have firms. Why don't we just buy everything we want in pieces from the individual contractors who make it? You want a car? Hire a guy to dig iron ore out of the earth, then hire somebody else to smelt the ore, then hire another guy to hammer it into the shape of a fender, and then hire some other person to put it all together, and then you got a car. The transactions you would have to manage to do your purchases that way would just eat up the gains that you would have from buying anything. It would be just woefully inefficient. And so we form companies where people have the right to order workers around, do this, do that, we pay you a salary every week, and then we offer the product for sale. That's more efficient. It's a way of economizing on transaction costs or negotiation costs with individuals, suppliers. Before Coase wrote, there was a way of thinking about externalities that was made completely obsolete by his insight. It was always the language of the law when there were externalities involved to talk about the emitter of the smoke as a perpetrator. A perpetrator. The same word that the cops use when they got a child molester. We got a perpetrator in the back here. The guy who was damaged by the smoke, what was he? He was a victim. We got a perpetrator and a victim. That means a good guy and a bad guy. And the law was crafted with that vision of the parties involved. Coase said, no, that's the wrong way to think about externalities. That's not the right conceptual framework to think about externalities in. Sarah, the violinist, wasn't a perpetrator. She was pursuing a totally worthwhile objective. She was trying to get better at playing the violin. That's not a bad thing. We don't want to impugn it by assigning a judgmental term to it. What about the guy who hears the violin music and doesn't like it? Is he a victim? No, he just wants peace and quiet. He was disturbed. He's not a victim. He has interests, and his interests are in conflict with her interests. You have two people whose interests are mutually in conflict. There's no perpetrator, there's no victim. You just have people whose circumstances confront them with a shared problem. And Coase's insight was it's in their shared interest to solve that problem as cheaply as possible. Never mind who's guilty, never mind who's innocent. what's the cheapest way to solve the problem? And sometimes it will be cheaper for the person that we used to label as the victim to adjust. Sometimes it will be cheaper for the perpetrator to adjust. But there's no general rule that says always punish the perpetrator, always get that person to make the adjustment, always let the victim get off scot-free. It's a practical problem. What's the cheapest way to solve this problem that we face? That's a revolutionary insight you have to recognize. There aren't good guys and bad guys. There are people with shared problems. I was just
wondering if this doesn't really work well in real life, why is it so important for it?
You mean if you can't negotiate?
Yeah, you said that it doesn't really work well. People don't actually come to this conclusion.
Because the insight has implications for what you should do when you can't negotiate too. The conservatives thought the main idea was people can solve their problems because they can negotiate. Now we don't have to worry about government. Coase never believed that. His main line of work was about what happens when you can't negotiate. You can't negotiate with all these different independent contractors, so you buy from a firm that does that for you to economize on the negotiating costs. And so too, will there be implications of his insight for the cases where you can't negotiate, where it's not practical? What should the government do then? And we'll see what the implication is in that case. But again, this is the key thought behind the whole exercise. You can't be happy with the small pie on the left if it's possible to have a bigger pie by resolving the problem in a cost-efficient way. You'll see this more clearly in the context of a couple of practical examples, I think. Yeah.
So does this incentivize the perpetrator to, say, emit more pollution or play?
Yeah, it might. And that might be one reason that negotiation is not a practical way to solve the problem. Yeah, good point. Okay, you confronted a version of this problem, many of you, when you came. Should you live together with someone else when you come to Ithaca, or should you have a place all of your own? It's a trade-off. Life is one bad decision after another. If you live by yourself, it's more expensive. If you live with someone else, you got someone else to deal with. There are externalities. There's no good outcome here. Or you could say, each outcome's good. Let me pick the better one of the two. It's a matter of perspective. So you can live with someone in a 2-bedroom apartment. That'll cost you $500 a month. Or you can live by yourself in a 1-bedroom for $300 a month. Why would you want to live with somebody in a 2-bedroom apartment? It's cheaper. If the two of them live separately, they're going to pay a total of $600 a month. They're going to pay a total of $500 a month if they can figure out a practical way to live together. I'm going to assume away every problem associated with having a roommate except one. Yeah, normally it's more complicated than the example I'm going to show you, but the spirit of the example captures everything that's relevant about the problem you actually do face. So here, they neither like nor dislike having another person around. You give up some privacy, but you got somebody to talk to. It's a wash on all those concerns, except for one thing. Ted likes to play the trumpet late at night. He's not a perpetrator. He just likes to play the trumpet. He doesn't want to disturb anybody, but if he plays the trumpet and Bill is sharing the apartment with him, then Bill can't sleep. Or he can't sleep when he wants to sleep. He has to go to bed later and get up later. So that's the problem. Should they live together? We don't have enough information to even think about how to answer that question. Let's introduce some additional texture into this problem. So Ted values being able to play the trumpet when he wants to at $150 a month. Rather than give up that right, that's what he'd pay. Bill, for his part, says, I don't want to listen to that trumpet. How much would I pay to avoid it? Would I pay $50 in a heartbeat? $60? Yes. $70? Yes. $80 is when he wavers. He says, nah, not any more than that. It's worth $80 to him to avoid listening to the... Will they live together or separately? There's an answer. Will they live separately? Gather in confidence. Will they live together? Okay, there's disagreement about what they'll do. This question isn't as easy as it sounds. A lot of people think it's obvious they should live together. Those people are in the minority. Many more people think it's obvious they shouldn't live together. Well, what should they do? How about if we use the cost-benefit test to see if they ought to live together? What's the benefit of living together? There's a number that's the answer to that question. The benefit is exactly $100 a month. Why? Because that's the amount of rent they'll save if they live together. That's the motive for considering living together. It's cheaper, $100 a month. What's the cost of living together? This is a little harder. This is where people stumble. What's the cost of living together? Suppose I put a gun to their heads and said to them, you have to live together. What would they do?
Yeah, I thought the benefit was $50, right? Because it's 500 divided by 2, 250 versus 300. Am I missing something?
No, the benefit, if the two of them live together, they're going to pay $500. If the two of them live together, they're going to pay $600. The gain is $100. Total, yeah, total gain.
I was going to answer your earlier question.
Okay.
So if-
What's the cost of living together? That's the question you want to answer?
Yeah, so
Yeah.
basically then the person who's ready to pay up to 150 would just pay the person who's ready to pay up to 80, and then they can still.
What's the cost of living together? There's a number that answers that question. It's 80. So I put a gun to their head, you have to live together. There are only two ways to solve this problem. I'm going to consider only two anyway. One is Ted stops playing the trumpet at night. He wants to do it, but we say, no, if you're going to live together, you can't play the trumpet at night. Okay, that's one way to solve the problem. The second way to solve it that I'm going to consider is to tell Bill, suck it up. Just live with the noise. If we had to choose between those two options, which would we choose? Suck it up. Why? Because to Bill, it's only costs $80 to endure the noise. It would cost Ted $150 to give up playing. It's better to choose the least costly solution to the problem than the most costly solution to the problem as a general principle. So what's the cost of living together? It's $80. That's the uniquely correct answer to the question, what's the cost of living together? Okay, now we have the two building blocks for answering the question, should they live together? The benefit of living together is 100. The cost of living together is 80. Should they live together? Yes! Absolutely yes. Christian.
So isn't the total cost, I forget their names properly, of the
Ted
one,
and Bill.
the one that doesn't like hearing the trumpet music, isn't his total cost now 250 plus 80, which is 330, which is higher than his cost of
Ah, so suppose I said to Bill, well, the rent's 500, your share is 250, so you come here and then you got to listen to the trumpet. That's another 80 of cost on you. You're paying 330. You could have lived by yourself and not have to listen to the trumpet at all. Well, how much would you pay then? 300. You're out of there. That's not going to work for you. So does that mean they shouldn't live together?
No.
You don't want to say yes, because that would be a violation of the cost-benefit principle, wouldn't it? So this is why people get this one wrong. They assume that there are perpetrators and victims, and the rent ought to be evenly divided, and then we work from there. If this deal is going to work, it's got to be beneficial to both parties for it to work. what's the most that the two parties would be willing to pay to do this? What's the most that Bill would be willing to pay? If he lives together with Ted, he's going to suffer $80 in damage from the trumpet noise. We already arrived at the conclusion that if he lives together, the cheapest thing to do in response would be to say, suck it up, Bill. It's better for you to bear a cost of 80 than it is for Ted to bear a cost of 150. So I can live alone for 300, or I can go live with him and suffer through the trumpet noise. What's the most I'd be willing to pay to live with him? Answer, $220. Why? Because I could go live by myself at 300 and not have any trumpet noise. Or if I paid $220 and lived with him, I'd be exactly as well off as before. I'd have cheaper rent. That's the upside, $80 benefit. $80 worth of noise cost, that's the downside. I'd be indifferent between living together and living with him and living alone if the rent for the shared apartment were $220. So if you start with a presumption that the rent's got to be $250 each, there's no deal you can make here. But why should that be the presumption? There's a deal open to them. Suppose we want to let each of them benefit equally from this deal. They're going to split the rent so that each gets a share of the surplus made possible by living together. What is that surplus? It's the gain, 100 minus the cost, 80. There's $20 in surplus. So let's charge each guy 10 less than the maximum he'd be willing to pay, and we ought to make this deal work in a way that's fair to both of them, advantageous to both of them. Bill's reservation price is $220. Let's charge him $210. What's Ted's reservation price? $300. Why is it so high? That's what he would pay to live alone. And there's no advantage to him of living alone compared with living together unless there's a rent saving, because he gets to play his trumpet either way and he doesn't mind having the other guy around by assumption. And so the reservation price for him for living together is $300. Let's give him a $10 surplus and charge him $290. Bill pays $210, Ted pays $290. The total amount of rent we have collected to give to the landlord is exactly the amount that we need to collect. And so we're done. We're done. Question, Chandana. Okay, you're saying maybe it won't be practical to have this negotiation. And maybe that's why many of you have never engaged in a negotiation like this in your experience thus far. It'd be interesting what would happen if you did try to engage in a negotiation like this. Would people look at you like you're crazy? But yes, people posture. It might be that Bill says, oh, trumpet noise. It would be like having my arm cut off. If I had to live with trumpet noise, I wouldn't be. He's trying to posture in a way to get his rent as low as possible. And Bill would say, trumpet, I could play it or not play it. Doesn't matter to me. He doesn't want to pay much for the right to play it. And so oftentimes deals will get scuttled because they can't negotiate.
Why do you ignore the $150 when considering Ted's reservation?
Because he doesn't have to stop playing. If he had to stop playing, it would cost him $150 to do that. Why don't we take into account the $150 as a cost of living together? Because it isn't a cost of living together. If they live together, they'll solve the problem in the least costly way available, which is for Bill to suck it up. It's not a cost. What if it was $1 billion? It would be irrelevant, because we wouldn't ask him to stop playing the trumpet. Once his cost of stopping gets above 80, then that's the right way to solve the problem, is to have Bill just listen to the trumpet, and it wouldn't matter how much bigger it was. Okay, but as I say, negotiation's often impractical. And there the law steps in. The law says what you can do. And the pattern in the law is interesting to try to discern. So here's a hospital. People need to sleep in the daytime. They're trying to recover from surgery or other illnesses. Should we allow people to make noise near the hospital? Normally, if somebody doesn't start up from a stop sign quickly enough to suit you, it's legal for you to lean on your horn. The year I lived in New York, the drivers from New Jersey took full advantage of that privilege. If anybody was a little slow getting out of their way, it was bah, all night long, horns blaring. Maybe that shouldn't have been such a liberal allowance. And I think now the New York City laws do fine you for blowing your horn. But outside a hospital, you shouldn't blow your horn. And so we set limits on that. In other areas, we let you blow the horn because the cost to you of not being able to blow your horn is maybe bigger than the nuisance value to people when you do blow your horn. The noise ordinances in neighborhoods reflect that. Look at the Ithaca noise ordinances. Some of you may be forced to look at them because you'll get police coming to complain about the noise emanating from your apartments. The noise law is written in such a way to take into account, at least in a rough sense, who can adjust to this problem more cheaply. The noise ordinance says you can't make noise after 11 p.m., let's say, on weeknights in many cities. It's 12 or 12:30 on Fridays and Saturdays. Why is it a different threshold for the noise ordinance to kick in on Friday and Saturday from what it is on the weekend? It's a cost-benefit principle. If you're having a party on Monday or Tuesday, nobody's going to come. So there's not much benefit to making noise on Monday and Tuesday. So that argues for curbing the noise that people make more strenuously when there wouldn't be much benefit sacrifice from doing it. And what about the cost of the noise? Most people don't have to get up to go to work on Saturday and Sunday, so making noise at night on Friday and Saturday is less costly to people than if you make noise on Monday or Tuesday when people do have to get up early to go to work the next day. So behind the structure of the law, there's some texture there. Arguments over the decades have molded the law in such a way that the rules that tell you what you can and can't do are trying to steer people towards the negotiated solutions they would have reached on their own if it had been practical to negotiate, which it often isn't. And so we can see that in the texture of the law in a whole variety of cases. So the law forbids trespass on urban property in Ithaca. It does not forbid trespass on property located along the shore of Cayuga Lake. This is an example I take from my own experience. We have a cottage on the west shore of the lake. Let's say it's the cottage at B. We have a house near campus. It's the house at B, let's suppose. In our house at B, it was once the practice for students to cut through our yard in order to reduce the distance they had to walk to get to campus. I would be sitting there reading my New York Times in my underwear. People would walk by the big kitchen window and look in, and that was a cost to me, I felt like. I felt like I'd be willing to pay something for that not to happen. I can't negotiate with people and say, I'll give you 50 cents if you won't walk across my property. That would be impractical. It would generate perverse incentives. There would be a long line of people willing to accept payments for not walking across my property. So what did I do? I built a fence across the back of my property. You can't walk across my yard anymore. If you don't like it, tough, is my response. Go complain to the police. What will the police tell you? I'm sorry, sir, there's nothing we can do about that. He's within his rights to exclude you from trespassing across his property. Ha! I liked that outcome. Here's another outcome that was strikingly different. Here, if somebody wants to walk across my property, they can do it, and there's nothing I can do about it. I'm not allowed to build a fence here. They can go blah, 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 like that to me, and I'm without recourse. I just have to sit there and endure it. The law is different in the two cases. Why is it different? This is why this is interesting. If you say to this guy, he wants to go visit his friend at D, sorry, you can't walk across there. Frank doesn't want you walking across there. What's his recourse? He's got to go up a 0.6 of a mile drive, rutted roadway, to 89. Then he's got to watch out for the drunk drivers leaving the Glenwood Pines. He's got to drive a couple of miles on 89 and then come down another steep, difficult road to get to D. That's a lot of schlepping just to go from here to here. It's a huge extra burden. And so the law says, go ahead and walk across his property. That's interesting, I think, that the law is different in those two cases. If it were just different in a random way, it wouldn't be interesting. But it's different in a way that tracks exactly what Coase's insight suggested would be the difference. When you can't negotiate solutions privately, set the law up so that the person who has to bear the adjustment to an externality is the one who can do it most cheaply. Here, if a student can't walk across my yard to get where he's going, what's the adjustment? Go around. It's hardly any farther than if you walk across my yard. The cost of adjustment's very small in that case. Here, the cost of adjustment is much larger. And so we say, place the burden on me rather than on the person who would have to go around. You don't think that's interesting? I don't know what to say. That's as interesting as it gets in economics, I think. You get bumped into by the law no matter where you go. The law is telling you you can do this, you can't do that. That's not just noise coming at you, that's texture, that's information coming at you. And if you can think about it and recognize the patterns in it, that's stimulating. That's part of why we work for less money at the university than people get in other domains, because we're around people who find ideas stimulating. I hope you all end up at a place where people won't be discouraging you to think about ideas and taking pleasure in them. It's free to do that. What a nice thing for you if you could take pleasure in thinking about the things you see out there. Property laws of all sorts are shaped by these kinds of arguments. Let's suppose that a past president of Cornell had a house with a sweeping view of the lake. He loved the view. Then the provost bought the property just below and is thinking about building a house on it. He's got two designs, one that is 1 story, another that's taller, a 2-story design. The problem is that the 2-story design would block Skorton's view completely. Should he build 1 story or should he build 2 stories? This is an externality. You recognize that it's an externality. Maybe they can negotiate with one another, maybe they can't. Let's put some numbers on. Suppose Skorton values the view at 100. Let's suppose Fuchs values the 1-story house at 200 and the 2-story house at 280. If the law said nothing about what kind of house you could build, and if they couldn't talk to one another, what would Fuchs do? He'd do what? Because he likes it better. He gets 280 benefit from it. He'd get only 200 benefit from the one-story house. What's the efficient outcome? The one-story house is the right outcome. Who's to say what's the right outcome? Isn't that presumptuous on my part? I'm not saying it's the right outcome because I think it's the right outcome. I'm saying it's the right outcome because they think it's the right outcome as revealed by the valuations they assign to the outcomes in question. The view is worth 100. The value of the extra story is worth 80 to Fuchs. The benefit of having the view is greater than the benefit of having the house that blocks the view. There shouldn't be a house that blocks the view. That's clear from the valuations that are assumed. So they would negotiate. Scorton would offer Fuchs a payment to build only a one-story house. How big would the payment have to be? At least 80. Why? Because the two-story house is worth 80 more to Fuchs than the one-story house. You're not going to give me at least 80, I'll build the two-story house. So he offers at least, what's the maximum Fuchs could demand as compensation for not building his preferred mode of house? 100, that's all the view's worth to Scorton. But as many of you have intuitively seen, this negotiation's not going to be easy necessarily. There's going to be incentives for each person to posture a little bit. Maybe Scorton's going to say, I don't give a damn about the view, really. The grandkids come once in a while, they like it, but we've gotten used to it, we don't care. Why? Because he doesn't want to pay too much to retain the view. And what about Fuchs? What are his incentives? He's going to say, you don't let me build a two-story house, it's not even worth owning this lot. What was I thinking? He wants to extract the biggest compensation payment he can get. It's real easy for negotiations like that to break down and go nowhere.
So
Peter.
could you view the posturing as like a prisoner's dilemma layered on top of this negotiation?
Of course you could. Good insight. Yeah, they have incentives to posture in ways that in the end are going to make them worse off because it'll prevent them from reaching a deal. But if you posture and I don't, then I get a smaller share of the surplus than you get. So yeah, good insight. Okay, so negotiations are often impractical. And in that case, we try to define the property rights in such a way as to encourage what we think would be, on average, the efficient outcome. Who can adjust more easily? The person who loses the view or the person who loses the right to build whatever size house he wants to build? And this set of examples, I think, codifies what is the real Coase theorem or the real Coase insight. It's not what happens when people can negotiate. That's interesting and is a useful starting point for the discussion. But the real interesting insight is that in general, people can't negotiate as a practical matter. And so the law tries to solve the problem for them by mimicking, as best the involved parties can manage, the transactions they would have agreed to if it had been possible for them to negotiate. We want the efficient outcome. We know that everybody can get a bigger slice if we do that. And so what do? We try to place the burden of adjustment on the externality on the party that, as best we can tell, can accomplish that adjustment at the lowest cost. In the case of Bill and Ted, it was Bill. So we might say, in general, we don't prohibit instrument playing in shared apartments. That's a case where negotiation might be practical, it might not. Think about the zoning laws in different places. You've got a house in San Francisco. You want to build up. The law in San Francisco, in terms of what zoning regulations permit, is extremely strict. You want to build up in a way that's going to block my view? No, you can't do that. There's a presumption. Can I reach agreement with somebody to take a payment for letting him build up in a way that violates the zoning law written on my behalf to protect me? Yeah, maybe in specific cases I can negotiate around the presumption in the law, but the presumption is based on the idea that we can't negotiate, and they're trying to say what would be the efficient outcome, to let the person build up and block the view or to protect the view. That's a very strict set of zoning laws we see in San Francisco. Now go to Kansas City. The laws are very lax there. You want to build up? Please, build up. Why is the zoning law different in Kansas City from what it is in San Francisco? You can't block that view, but you can block that view. There's nothing to see in Kansas City. It's flat there. They have stockyards there. Are you from Kansas City? I'm sorry if I think I've been to Kansas City once. I don't remember much about what it's like there. This is just an example. So if you're from Kansas City, I don't mean any. Imagine some city where there's no view. That's what I'm talking about.
If you're a lawmaker in San Francisco and you're seeing that apartment rents are getting extremely out of hand, isn't it in your best interest to encourage people to build higher?
Yeah. It's not like this is the only issue that we need to worry about. Yeah. And strict zoning laws in coastal cities are one of the reasons that the rents are out of reach for a lot of people in those cities, and the cost of that may be vastly greater than any of the costs associated with views. Yeah, fair point and well taken. Think about the laws in cities generally. You can't build your building right up to the edge of your lot. You got to set it back. Why is that? If you could build 100 stories right up to the edge of the lot, the sun would set at 9:30 in the morning at street level. There'd be no light. People don't like that. There'd be a sense of claustrophobia in the city. So you can set back a certain distance before you build. That's required. You go up a certain number of stories, then you got to set back again. You want to go up more, then you set. They're trying to preserve a passageway for the light to get to the street level. It's an externality. The law is telling you you can't do what you want to do. Is it legitimate to tell you can't do what you want to do? If what you want to do imposes unreasonable costs on other people, what's illegitimate about taking that into account and saying you can't do it? This is a fundamental issue in the case of political philosophy. I have many friends who are libertarians, and their position is, in essence, I want to be able to do whatever I want to be able to do without regard to what costs I impose on you. So it might be, I want to do something, I get almost no benefit from doing it. It imposes huge costs on you. Still, I have a right to do it. I have a right. People have rights. Nobody would grant somebody that right if you were negotiating to form a society. Suppose we were coming off an ark and we had to build a new society. And up for discussion was, what should the rules be? One group says it wants to have the right to do whatever it wants to do. Would we welcome them into our society? I'd be a little reluctant to do that. You mean you want to take actions that would impose tens of thousands of dollars of costs on me and generate pennies and benefits for you without regard to the imbalance? No. Most societies don't let people do whatever they want to do. No society does. There's no libertarian society on the earth. If that was the right way to organize things, there would be a government that did it that way. Somebody would have bought an island and set up rules so that anybody could do whatever he or she wanted to do. But that's not reasonable. No person who's reasonable would agree to those terms. Why would I want to live there? They can harm me without restraint, even if it's of no value to them to do what they want to do. That's unreasonable. The Coase view outlines a reasonable middle ground. The law can restrict you, but first it has to show that by doing that, you get a better outcome than if you don't do that. better outcome as measured by the burden you're placing on people to adjust to the harm that behavior by others causes to them. The free speech laws have texture in them. You can insult people if you choose, but only up to a point. You want to tell somebody he's stupid, you can do that. I'm free under the law. I could make a set of remarks that would leave someone in this room feeling really injured. The law would protect my right to do that. The law protects our right to cause enormous injury, but not because we don't think injury is a bad thing. There was a column by Ann Landers, I think it was, maybe it was one of the other advice columnists. A guy wrote in, he said he had something on his conscience. He and his friends, when they were in high school, had gone through the yearbook and they had voted that a specific classmate was the ugliest girl in the class. And then they called her up and they told her that she had been voted that honor by their little clique. And he said he was still haunted by the kind of anguished sound that she made before dropping the phone and the line went dead. What can I do to make amends for what we did? He wanted to know. She told him he couldn't turn back the clock. There was nothing really he could do to undo the injury. He could try to be kind to others going forward, blah, blah, blah. But the interesting thing about the letter was that what the kids did was legal. There are other things they might have done that would have caused way less injury than what they did do that would have been illegal. If you ask the girl, which would you rather have happen to you? That call come in one night? That's A. Or B, some kid walks up to you and hits you hard on the leg with a stick. You don't want either thing to happen to you, obviously. But you got to choose. Which one would you choose? If I'm in that position, I say, hit me with a stick. It's a no-brainer. That'll hurt for a minute. I'll have a bruise for a few days, but then it's done. It's over. That girl probably still thinks about the experience that she had in her class that occasion. But we allow the one, we don't allow the other. The reason we allow the speech is that it's so difficult to write a law that would prohibit that speech without also prohibiting other forms of speech that we think are essential for preserving a functioning society. You have to be able to be free to tell people they're idiots. If they're being idiots, if it weren't for the possibility of social sanction, people would misbehave vastly more than they actually do misbehave. So we want to give people the latitude to cause injury when they speak, but not too much. But there's no way to fine-tune that, or not a very good way to fine-tune that. But that doesn't mean that it's without limit, the injury you can cause. You're not free to go to the State Theater during a crowded event and say, fire. That's not permitted. You can be imprisoned for doing that. It won't matter that you say, I got enormous utility from yelling fire, because the law is willing to say that over the large flow of cases involved in issues like that, the cost of yelling fire is vastly greater than the benefits to anyone of yelling fire, and so we're just going to say you can't do that. That seems like the best accommodation we can do in all likelihood. The law is flexible, it adapts. It used to be that you couldn't walk along the commons and be exposed to people dropping the F-bomb every 15 feet you walked between Aurora Street and Cayuga Street. If there was an Ithaca policeman on the commons, he would arrest a kid who was yelling the F-bomb on the commons. Now, nobody does anything. Maybe people have gotten used to hearing the F-bomb. They're not offended by it as much as they were in the old days. standards are elastic. Injury, the whole concept of what's injurious to you is open for discussion. There's a lot of ambiguity in the law, of course. But is the texture of the law shaped by Coase's insight? I think unmistakably yes is the answer to that question. We've got negative externalities. What do we do about them? Let's go back to this question that I started with. We've got two firms, X and Y. They've got these 5 production processes. There they are. There are the costs associated with them. Why is the dirty process cheaper than the expensive one? Because it costs money to filter the smoke out. Nothing mysterious there. Are some firms able to get the smoke out more cheaply than others? Unquestionably, yes, in practice. Some are good at that. Others, here's a firm that's good at it, others aren't so good at it. It costs them more to get smoke out. Up to a point, at least, that's true. If pollution's unregulated, what are they going to do? They're going to use process A. Why? Because we can't imagine a real-life situation where the millions of polluters and millions of victims could possibly negotiate privately to solve that problem. They'll just do the dirty process. We'll get 4 tons of pollution from each firm. Now we want to cut back pollution by half. We've got 2 proposals. Each firm cut back by half or put a tax on pollution. That's the other method. As a matter of fact, the way we used to do this in the pollution regulation domain in the United States was method A. The early clean water legislation said we measure how much you dumped into the river in a base year. By some future date, we want those emissions to be blank percent lower than they were during the base year for everybody who's dumping into the river. That was a monumentally stupid way to regulate pollution, as the example here will show. So we're going to set a tax of T on each ton. That's the alternative method. How large would the tax have to be if we're going to try to achieve the goal of cutting back pollution by half? And how would the cost of the 2 approaches compare? Would the tax be more expensive, or would the blanket across the board regulation be more expensive? Let's explore. If everybody has to cut back by half, it's easy to see what the cost is. Firm X would have to go from its current process, process A, back to process C. Firm Y would have to go from A to C as well. The cost involved of making those moves would be $500 for firm X, the difference between 700 and 200. The cost for firm Y would be the difference between 140 and 50, that's 90. So the total cost of getting the pollution cut by half is going to be $590 per day. That's proposal A, everybody cut back by half. Now let's explore the tax alternative. A tax of T per ton. How would a firm think about its response to a tax? Well, if I don't do anything, if I continue using process A, what am I going to pay? There's a number. 4T. The tax is T per ton. Process A emits 4 tons a day of pollution. If I keep using process A, the government's going to say, all right, that costs you 4T. What's my option besides paying the tax on the full 4 tons from process A? I can switch to a cleaner process that'll cost me, but I'll save money in tax. So if I'm thinking about the first switch, I'll say, what's the cost of switching to the next cleanest process from A, that is to say, going from A to B? And whatever that cost is, I'll compare it to how much I'll save in tax, which will be exactly T since I've cut my pollution by 1. So if the tax is $50 a ton, let's say, we'll use that as an example, what's going to happen? What's firm X going to say? they're going to tax me $50 a ton. What should I do? If you're managing firm A and you don't know what to do, you're not ready to go out into the world and be a manager. What should you do if you're the manager of firm A and they say, we're going to tax you $50 a ton, and all you care about is your bottom line? What should you do? Keep producing with process A. Why? If you do that, you'll have to pay 400 you'll have to pay 4 tons times $50 a ton. That's 200 in tax a day. That's not good. But what's your alternative? You can cut back your pollution. That would cost you 90 to do that. It would save you 50 in tax. That's a loser. So stand pat if you're firm A and they say $50 a ton. Okay, $50 a ton, I'll pay it. If you're firm X, if you're firm Y, you say, I'll cut back by 1 ton. That'll cost me 30. I save 50 in tax. Check, that computes. Shall I continue cutting back? It's going to cost me now 60 to cut back. All I'm going to save is 50. No, I'm going to stop here. So the firms would know how to respond to a $50 tax, but their response would fall short of what we're trying to achieve. What's the solution to that problem? Raise the tax. That's what you would do. The tax isn't defective. It just wasn't set high enough. How high should you raise it? I've done the work. I can report to you that if we have a tax of $91 per ton, T equals 91 per ton, work it out. Firm X says, should I clean up? Well, if I move from A to B, it's going to cost me 90. I'm going to save 91 in tax. That's not a huge reward, but I'm going to do it. I'm better off if I do it. Firm Y cuts back here because 30 is less than 91, cuts back again because 60 is less than 91, and then cuts back still again because 90 is less than 91. The cost is less than the savings that you'll save from paying less in tax. And so we get a new distribution of results here. Firm X adopts process B, and firm Y adopts process D. What's the total pollution? 4 tons a day. 1 from firm Y, 3 from firm X. That's exactly the target we were trying to hit, so the tax worked. I set it up so it would work. But notice the key point that emerges from the example. What's the total cost of getting the pollution cut by half if we do it this way compared to if we have each firm cut back by the same proportion? The cost now is 90 a day for firm X, it's 180 a day for firm Y, and the total cost is 270 a day, less than half what we were paying under the crude method. Everybody cut back by the same proportion. The tax obeys the Coase suggestion. If you have an externality, you should place the burden of adjusting to it on the party that can accomplish it at the lowest cost. Let's go back to the table. This is the firm that's good at responding to pollution control efforts. It can cut back pollution more cheaply than that firm can for any given level of output. That will be true. Here you've got the lion's share of the effort being undertaken by the firm that can do it most cheaply. Here they get involved in the process, but only because there was an initial step they could take that was cheaper than the ultimate step that this firm would have had to take. We might have a solution where one firm did all the work. What if the other firm complained, or what if that firm, the one that was doing all the work, complained, that's not fair, I'm carrying the whole burden here? What would your response be if you were the lawyer representing firm X and they filed a complaint against you, you weren't carrying your fair share of the pollution cutback burden? Would you be at a loss for words if you had to deal with a complaint like that? I wouldn't be. I know what the brief would be that I would write if I were the lawyer given that assignment. I'd say, this guy's complaining, he's carrying the whole burden. It's way cheaper for you to carry the burden than for us to carry it because you can carry it so much more cheaply. And if you carry the burden, we can each get an outcome that's better for both of us than if we split the burden up in some other way. And note that the way we do that is that, yes, I'm only reducing smoke by 1 ton a day, but for the 3 tons of smoke I'm paying, I'm emitting, I'm paying a tax of 91 each on those. I'm paying my share of the burden here too. This method is efficient and it's fair. There's no argument against it. We should be doing this. We should be taxing harmful activities in situations like this. We've tried to do this and people resist. They hear the word tax and they think bad. But you have to tax something. If you don't tax anything, you can't have a government. If you don't have a government, you can't have an army. If you don't have an army, you get invaded by some other government that has an army paid for by its mandatory taxes, and then you pay taxes to that government. So if you think tax is bad, you haven't thought about it. The only question is, what should you tax? How much should you tax it?